Hey everyone, welcome to Humanities 305, Writing the Humanities. Today I wanted to focus on developing an academic argument and what that means and how it might be different from other papers that you have written. So we're going to spend some time on what that means today. I want us to think about this quote throughout the semester. It really helps to provide a lot of structure for the art and the literature and the music and the films that we're going to watch this semester and analyze. The good is the beautiful, and I want us to think about what that is, right? What does it mean to be beautiful? What does it mean to be good? And I want us to really focus on that aspiration. This becomes the gold standard for art, and generally what we're going to take a look at is the ideas of beauty are going to be radically different in the 20th century. The 20th century art and ideas are going to be responding to a different environment. It's going to affect the way that they represent that notion of beauty. But I also want us to think about this in terms of writing. What is it that makes a work of art or a work of writing beautiful, right? How does it become good? And that's something that we can consider or concern ourselves with this semester. Today I wanted to focus on, as we think about developing an academic argument, I want us to think about a voice. And this seems a little bit different, but they're actually intricately related in that in order to have to write well or to write good, as Plato asserts, we need to be able to have a voice and to know to whom we're writing. And so I want us to think or to imagine, and I call this Burke's Parlor. Imagine that you enter a gelateria, right? And I want us to think about this in terms of humanities majors generally we're going to do things that are just a little bit different, a little bit more culturally refined than perhaps others. So we're not going to just eat ice cream, we're going to eat gelato, right? That's something that we would do within the humanities. Imagine that you're meeting some friends there, you come late. When you arrive, you notice that your friends have been there for a while, and they've been busily engaged in a heated discussion. They are so busy talking that they don't notice that you've entered, and they do not stop to tell you exactly what they're talking about or what has already been said. And I want you to imagine this in terms of they're talking about something as you kind of pick up what's going on. They're talking about something that's important to you, whether it's Harry Potter or Avengers or Star Wars, whatever the case may be, right? It could be sports or current events, politics, something that you're interested in. I want you to think about how do you feel, right? Kind of coming late to the party, trying to catch up, right? Do you feel a little bit left out or a little bit behind? So then what do you do as a result, right? Feeling kind of left out and feeling behind. And generally what we do is we sit there and we listen for a minute. We get caught up so we can get a sense of what's already been said, because we don't want to just say something that someone already said 10 minutes ago. We want to make sure that what we're adding to the discussion is actually new, right? So here's what happens in this idea of Burke's Parlor. You listen for a little bit until you're confident that you know what they're discussing and formulated your own ideas on the topic. You voice your ideas, right? So your thoughts, your passion about this. Someone takes a different position than you. Another person comes to your defense. Others align against you, while others provide support of your position. The discussion continues for hours. It gets late, and you notice that you must leave. But the discussion goes on. And I think that this is a way to think about writing. Too often, people come to writing thinking that they're just writing to avoid, that someone's going to read it maybe once, and it just goes off into the ether. And if you think about writing that way, then it's not going to be as passionate, it's not going to be as motivated, it's not going to be as focused as it would be if you actually think that you're adding to a discussion, because that's really, when we come into the humanities, that's really what we're doing. We're entering a discussion that's been going on for sometimes decades, sometimes centuries, sometimes even millennia. As we think about Plato's gold standard for what is beautiful, we're entering into a larger discussion about people that have written something before us, what they've said, their ideas, their argument on a topic, and then we're entering into it, we're adding our own thoughts. But in order for us to do that within an academic setting, we need to know what's been said, know what we can then add to the discussion, right? But we also have to realize sometimes we think that whatever we're going to say is going to end the discussion, and there's never going to be anything else written on it because we've solved all the problems. And that's way too much to put on our shoulders, right? Just think that we're out there to add our own discussion in this, gelateria, this mythical kind of place that we're invited others to. We're inviting Aristotle and Plato. We're inviting Michelangelo and Picasso, all these great ideas that have come before us. They're all part of the discussion, and we get to enter into that. We get to add to what they have to say. And so it's something that we need to think about as we enter into this discussion. Think about that you are actually talking to these individuals, and you're talking to someone that will actually focus your writings and make your writings a lot better. Here's something else that will also help to improve your writing instantly. This is a quote by Albert Einstein. He said, "If I had an hour to solve a problem, I'd spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem and 5 minutes thinking about the solutions." And this is so interesting because it's counterintuitive to the way most people think. Generally, when we have a problem, we're spending 55 minutes actually thinking about the solution to the problem. And what he's arguing here is that's actually different, right? What we really need to do is we need to understand the problem itself. And once we truly understand the problem within its complexity, then the solution becomes much easier. And so in terms of writing, we can think about this as, too often people just want to jump to their computers and type up their paper, right, for a class, just so that they can get it over with, right? The problem is I have an assignment due, therefore I want to get that over with. But what he suggests, if we spend a little more time focusing on the actual problem itself in terms of writing, this would be brainstorming, concept mapping, doing an outline that really don't take that much time. But if we spent, maybe a half hour on doing that stuff, then the writing itself becomes much easier, right? So we can spend a lot less time on actually sitting in front of a blank screen looking at things and not really knowing where we're going or what to write. Once we have our ideas focused and a map of where to go, our ideas become much easier to flow, and the writing just actually happens. And so I think about this as if you're on a trip, if you're going on a vacation, and you're trying to get somewhere and you leave without a map, right? How are you going to get there? And that's really what writing without doing any brainstorming or any type of focus or an outline is really like, right? It's just like going on that vacation without a map or without a guidebook. It's just not going to go well. And so if we spend a little bit more time on brainstorming, then we can spend less time on actually the act of writing. So that's one thing to think about. It's also interesting, this has multiple applications to it, which we'll talk about this semester in terms of actually understanding the complexities of ideas. We'll take a look at and examine very complex problems within the humanities this semester. There's a tendency to jump to the knee-jerk reaction, and I'm going to ask you to slow down and to actually think through it so you can understand the complexities of the problem. All right. Part of that, right, part of understanding the complexity of the problem is understanding the differences between these two, right? So too often people come into class and they conflate analysis with plot summary. And I wanted to focus on what an academic argument is. An academic argument is analysis, and it's not plot summary. And there's some confusion with that, right? Plot summary, what that mainly does is it just lists some plot points. It goes A happened, then B happened, then C happened, then D happened. And that's I guess, fine as long as you're just trying to summarize the plot, but it's not really an academic argument. An academic argument is going at the more specifics about why the plot is important. So what plot summary would do is it would tell you what happened. What analysis does is it tells you why what happened is important. And so it's more of adding your ideas, your thoughts to the plot, and we'll talk more about that. But part of what analysis does, right, it explains specific elements within the text and why they're important, why they're significant. It explains the purpose, the effect, the meaning of important ideas. And so we'll take a handful of different ideas and say, this is why it's important. This is the argument of the author or the artist or the filmmaker, whatever the case may be. It determines the writer's intended meaning. And so if you're we'll take a look at Hemingway today and his Hills Like White Elephants. We'll be taking a look at what is his intended meaning as he takes a look at two individuals that are sitting at a train stop in Spain discussing some very weighted issues. What's the actual intent of the writer? And so we'll focus on the intended meaning. And then another way to think about analysis is using summary, but only to provide context for a deeper understanding. So you could go through a plot point and say, you have these two individuals sitting at a train station thinking about Hills Like White Elephants. But that's only used to figure out what's actually going on underneath the surface. And so you do use summary to a certain extent, but it's used sparingly and only to get to your ideas, to provide context for the reader. And so focusing on what I want you to do this semester is I want you to do analysis. I do not want plot summary. And so we'll work on that, right? That's really what an academic argument is. Another kind of different approaches within analysis, within critical analysis, is number one, why a type of an academic argument would focus on the theme, like what is the central idea, what's the central argument within this particular writing, or it would take a look at symbols. What do these symbols mean within a particular work of art or film or literature, whatever the case may be, or it would be taking a look at an allegory, discussion of one of multiple interpretations, right? So this would be maybe a larger discussion going on within the context of, say, creation myths or whatever the case may be. And taking a look at how this fits in within that kind of allegory or that type of story. Or another one would be take a look at a character, examine one character in detail and explain why he or she is significant. And so taking a look, for instance, at maybe Harry Potter and taking a look at Ron Weasley and why he is more significant than people originally think or on first glance they intend to think. All right, let's focus on the writing assignment. So for Journal 1, what you're going to be doing is an application of Burke's Parlor, where I'm getting you to really think about developing your academic voice, where you're actually responding to someone. So you're going to have a couple of different topics to choose from, but what each of them are going to do is they're going to be writing a response letter to someone who's taking an opposing view. And so imagining that you're kind of like in that Burke's Parlor where there's an ongoing discussion at the table, and then you're responding to someone else who has an opposing view. And so I'm trying to get you to think at the very beginning of the semester to improve your writing at the forefront is to think about the audience. Think about someone that you're writing to, and that will immediately improve your writing, right? So here's the assignment. Choose one from the list. Choose from the list of topics. Remember that I mainly will be looking for a clear thesis and supporting evidence. That's the number one and number two thing that I'm looking for. I'm looking for what is your argument, and then how well do you defend that argument. It does not matter what argument you make. What matters is how well you're able to defend your ideas. To help you consider your audience, this journal will require you to write a response letter to someone who takes an alternate point of view than your own. Your goal is to try to help that person to consider some new ideas that they may have missed. It's not necessarily to convince them, right, to get them to see your way. It's just to get them to see ideas that they may have overlooked, right, to have perhaps a new understanding or new appreciation. Too often in society today, we just want to shut others down and we don't really want to hear opposing views. We just want people to see our perspective. And what we really need to do is really think about more of a discussion rather than just being, confrontational, right? Rather than being confrontational, you can acknowledge the importance of his or her ideas in a small way and then offer your insights for him or her to consider. And so you can say, although I agree with this point that you're making, or although you make a really good point here, this is where I'm coming from. And so you acknowledge them. That helps them to drop their guard, so to speak, and then you come in and you provide your ideas. This will be due prior to class. They'll actually be due Monday will be when the rough draft is due. Please remember to upload your file on Canvas before class. All right, number 1. Write a letter to someone you disagree with your interpretation on Hills Like White Elephants regarding whether or not Jake has the abortion. We'll take a look at that story in detail in this lecture. Invent a name for the person to whom you're writing and make a case why you interpret the story the way that you do, right? So you want to be actually writing to someone that you're actually visualizing, right? So it could be a name of a real person, it could be a name of a fictional person that you're writing to, but I want you to envision someone, right? Use evidence from the story and remember to fully explain what the evidence proves. That's key to an academic writing, right? Is what your evidence proves. All right, the second one is to write a letter to someone you disagree with your analysis on Ulysses in Tennyson's poem Ulysses as a good leader, right? So we'll take a look at that in the subsequent lectures. We'll take a look specifically at Tennyson's poem and what makes a good leader, right? So again, invent a name for a person and then make a case why you interpret the poem differently. And the third one deals with Auden's Unknown Citizen and why he or she is, or why the unknown citizen is either admirable or not admirable, right? And so I want you to think about that. And again, visualize someone and then write a letter to that person with a different perspective than your own. And then I want you to remember to add your signature. You can invent a title for yourself if you want, and then to sign your letters. And it'll be a little bit different since we're all online this semester. We're not turning anything in. But I do want some type of title and your name at the bottom to make it more of a formal letter. So it's actually writing to someone. So what we're going to do throughout this semester as we focus on these lectures and the discussions that we're going to come to on Wednesdays are going to be designed to get us to think about specific aspects of the journal in a more deeper way, right? So getting at that Einstein's idea of actually understanding the problem before we get to the solution, before we get to actually the writing, I'm going to focus on the complexities of the problem. So then that way you'll understand it a little bit better and have a little bit more thoughts on it as you approach your actually writing. And I'll help you with the organization of that as you get towards that. But some of that organization you're going to have to do on your own as well with pre-writing strategies. All right, let's take a look at Hemingway's writings. And this is a quote that he wrote from a book that he wrote in the 1960s called Death in the Afternoon. It's about bullfighting. But within this particular book, he takes a look at actual writing. And he summarizes his technique. And this is what he says. He says, if a writer of prose knows enough about what he is writing about, he may omit things as strongly as though the writer has stated them. The dignity of the movement of an iceberg is due to only 1/8 of it being above water. A writer who omits things because he does not know them only makes hollow places in his writing. And so what he suggests here is that a good writer is able to dig deeper, right? To be able to write something in a way that he doesn't have to explicitly state things, but he can just lay them out there as though the reader then can pick up on and find the deeper meaning. So what's great about Hemingway's writings is that they focus more on the reader's ability to do interpretation, right? So rather than him telling us explicitly exactly what he's thinking or what he wants us to get from it, he wants us to be able to follow the action and to make connections and interpret the story. And so Hemingway's writings, as we think about academic arguments, it's prime for us to be able to go in there and to make connections and to come up with an argument. So that's one of the main reasons why I start with his writings at the beginning of the semester, because it really helps us to really think and dig deeper, right? So what he argues here, much like an iceberg, right? The syntax, the words that he uses is only going to be on the surface. What he's going to require us is to dig below the surface, to make connections and to figure out what it all means. And that's where, within the humanities, that's where our academic argument comes into play, right? Is making these connections. And to me, that's what makes his works beautiful, is having that flexibility. I know some people get really frustrated with Hemingway because they want his works to be more explicit, more focused. They don't like the ambiguous endings or the uncertain, right, the unclarity within his works. But to me, that makes it more interesting, because we can come to it with our own understanding and make our own connections. And so some writers, they like to, explicitly tell people exactly, right? Stephanie Meyer likes to tell you exactly what to think and how to feel, and Ayn Rand does this, and Atlas Shrugged as well, where she tells you exactly what to think and what her analysis is, and just doesn't really allow a lot of room for readers to come in and bring their own understanding and bring their own interpretation. And really, that's what makes it fun, right? That Burke's Parlor part of the discussion. Let's take a look at some of the deeper elements of Hills Like White Elephants, just to give you some of that context for you to think about as you start working towards completing Journal 1. Thinking about the actual title first and foremost, right? Hills Like White Elephants. It's an interesting title, kind of a literary allusion to white elephants. And for those of you that are familiar with a white elephant, maybe you've been to a white elephant party, you'll know, but those of you that are unfamiliar, what a white elephant party is generally you take a something, an object that's around your house or something that's maybe cheap at the store, and you wrap it and you take it to a party as kind of a gag gift, and then you present it to someone, and someone opens up, and that becomes their gift. And the idea of a white elephant is that it could be valueless to the giver, but it could be either valueless or valuable to the person receiving it, depending on what it is and who the person is. And so there's some ambiguity on whether the gift is actually valuable or unvaluable. As we think about that within the context of the story, mainly what we have here is two people sitting at a train station, as we see here kind of visualized, talking about their relationship, and more specifically, they're talking about an abortion. And so as we think about that in context to white elephants, we have to think about what is the white elephant within the story. And it could be, just one interpretation, it could be that the white elephant is the baby, right? It's something that it could be unwanted by one, but it could be very valuable and wanted by another. And this could be part of the crux of the disagreement that we're going to see within them. And so that could be part of it. The other idea are the hills, right? So Jig is looking off at the hills at the beginning of the story. The hills could be a reference to the actual physical hills that she's looking at Spain. It could be the baby bump, referring to again the white elephant of the baby. It could be the peaks and valleys of this relationship that they're going through, right? So the title itself, right, has a lot of room for interpretation and understanding. And what we do with it, right, your analysis is going to depend upon how you interpret it, right? But what we need to do is we need to take a look at these specific elements, and then we come to a greater understanding as we look at specific elements and try to find meaning within them. Thinking about the actual setting, I wanted to spend a few minutes on this particular slide, because I think that there's greater meaning that we can derive from it. Thinking about that 7/8 part of that iceberg underneath the surface that Hemingway alludes to. What we see here is the table that Jig and the American are sitting at. And Jig is at the very beginning, and we'll take a look at this. I'll read through some passages of it. She's looking off at some dry brown hills, and then she's going to get up, right? And the train station is in between two tracks, right, going in different directions, I suppose. And then she's going to get up halfway through the story. She's going to walk to the other side of the station with the other tracks, and she's going to see the Ebro River and fields of grain and trees. And so what we see within the context of the story, right, someone that might read that just be like, okay, he's just telling a setting that doesn't really mean anything. But someone that's actually digging a little bit deeper, thinking about an academic argument or thinking about making connections, might start to think about what does that actually mean, right? On one side, you have dry, barren hills, and on the other side, you have a river with fields of grain and trees. And so it could be this is the representation of barrenness, infertility, versus life with a river and water, right? Water is this life giver. And then fields of grain and trees, which is fertility. And so what you have are two people that are at a train tracks, or they're at a crossroads, so to speak, debating between whether they're going to go one way towards barrenness or another way towards fertility. And so in a very subtle way, without Hemingway actually telling you this is exactly what I'm trying to do here, he provides some very important context for understanding the deeper elements within the story that if you just read, kind of on a first reading, or you're just not really paying attention to the story, you might miss. And so what I'm asking you to do within the humanities, within academic arguments, is to slow down, right? Not to think about your assignments just to rush through them so you can go on to do other things, but actually think about what people are saying, right? Think about that. What is Hemingway, as he's coming to this gelateria, this mythical gelateria that we're at, what is he actually saying? We have to listen to his words. We have to really think about the deeper meaning to them so that we can come with a better understanding. All right, let me read through some of this with you. I'm going to pause at certain points to think about finding these deeper elements, right? That these words, he's painting pictures with these words and giving us a deeper understanding of what actually happens. Part of the argument for Journal 1 that I'm going to ask you to do is to determine whether she has the abortion or not. So let's take a look at some of the specific elements and see what we can derive from it. Although Hemingway doesn't say specifically what happens, he might give us some clues on the way he was leaning when he was writing the story. The hills across the Ebro Valley were long and white. On this side, there was no shade and no trees, and the station was between two lines of rails in the sun. And so this is the image that I was showing you in the previous slide. And so on this side, it's pretty hot, it's pretty dry, right? Close against this side of the station, there was a warm shadow of a building and a curtain made of string of bamboo beads hung across the open door into the bar to keep flies out. The American and the girl with him sat at the table in the shade outside the building. And so think about that, stopping there just for a minute, right? The ideas of the way he's describing these people could be important, right? The fact that he's an American and he's traveling in Europe indicates that at the time, Hemingway wrote this in 1927, and so at the time you have a lot of Americans who were after World War I traveling through Europe, mainly just kind of drifting. They didn't have a really definite aim in life today. We would call this adulting. They were having a difficulty with adulting. They just kind of wanted to flounder around and not really do anything, party, right? And so we see that kind of mindset. And so the 1927 audience reading this will be like, oh, I know exactly what this American is doing. And he's struggling with the war. We see this kind of loss and this disillusionment after the war. We'll talk a little bit more about this when we get to Dadaism. But this idea of just drifting around and not really having any focus, not really wanting a job or any type of career or going to college, right? They're just kind of drifting in life. Gertrude Stein called them the lost generation, and Hemingway was part of this, right? He was in the war, he was drifting himself, and so he would have identified with aspects of this. But it's also important how he describes his girlfriend, right? He doesn't describe her, the American and the woman with him. He says the American and the girl with him, which suggests that, I don't think that she's extremely young, right? Be a little scandalous, but she's probably in her, early 20s. And so she's young, so she's probably has a little bit more naivete, a little bit more innocence, so to speak. And so there's this age gap that he doesn't tell us this, right? He subtly indicates this. And if we just kind of glaze over it quickly, and without really thinking about why he's phrasing things the way he's doing it, then we might miss it. And so what we need to do is we need to think about that the masters out there, the classic writers and classic artists and classic filmmakers and composers, there are no accents with them, right? They've pored over this. They've edited it. It's not like they're just writing this once, right? These are after, painstaking months and months of rewriting and revising. So they're trying to get the words exactly right here. It was very hot, and the express from Barcelona would come in 40 minutes. It stopped at this junction for 2 minutes and went on to Madrid. And so the indication of Barcelona and Madrid, and they're in between the two, suggests that they're in Spain, right? And that's another underwater part of the iceberg. Spain is generally very traditional and very Catholic, right? Even to this day, they're very traditional. They kind of struggle with a lot of modern nuances that have, these contemporary changes that are occurring. They generally kind of tend to be about, 20, 30, 40 years behind the rest of the kind of Europe's curve that's progressing towards the future. Spain generally tends to drift behind a little bit because they like tradition, right? Another element of Spain is that they're very Catholic, and that helps to provide the structure for understanding this discussion about an abortion, right? The girl was looking off at the line of hills. They were white in the sun, and the country was brown and dry. And so we see her, and we kind of see through her eyes, and this is an image of what she would be looking at, minus the snow, right? Probably there wasn't any snow at the time, but that she was looking at this. But as she was looking out there, right, she's thinking without really thinking, right? And so as she sees them, they're brown, they're dry, they're barren. So what is she thinking about? She's probably thinking about this weighty topic that's driving a rift between her and her boyfriend or husband or fiance, whatever the case may be. Then she says, "They look like white elephants. I've never seen one." The man drank his beer. And so what we see here in this kind of difference is she still has this kind of childlike imagination, right? Kind of like children look at clouds and they see shapes that are there, right? They see forms that aren't really there, but they're just looking with their imagination. She still has this childlike imagination, but he, kind of coming from more of an adult kind of focus, he has this kind of more hardcore reason, even though he doesn't have, the adult kind of mindset of I'm going to get a job and have a definite aim in life. He still kind of has this kind of focus. I'm trying to be less like a child and more kind of hardcore reason. And so he doesn't necessarily have that imagination. So we see that difference, right? That age gap difference between them. He says, no, I haven't seen one, or I've never seen one. And she says, no, you wouldn't have. He says, I might have, the man said. Just because you say I wouldn't have doesn't prove anything. The girl looked at the bead curtain. They've painted something on it, she said. What does it say? And so this, again, helps us to indicate some of the aspects of their relationship. She doesn't speak the language. And so she's younger than him. She doesn't speak the language. And so at this point, it's giving us a subtle indication of who has more power, right? He does speak the language, and so he interprets it for us. He says, Anas del Toro, it's a drink. Could we try it, right? So she has that kind of innocence of, can we do something? Like she's asking permission, right? The man called, listen, through the curtain. The woman came out from the bar and said 4 reales, right? So she's asking for money. And then he tells her, we want 2 Anas del Toro. The woman asks, the waitress asks, with water, right? So he's kind of interpreting for her, right? So she says that in Spanish, even though Hemingway writes it in English for us. And then he turns to the girl and says, do you want it with water? The girl says, I don't know. Is it good with water? Looking for advice. It's all right. You want them with water? Asked the woman. Yes, with water. And so he orders for her. He's interpreting for her. The girl looked across at the hills. They're lovely hills, she said. They don't really look like white elephants. I just meant the coloring of the skin through the trees. And then he's kind of not really buying into this. He just says, should we have another drink? All right, she says. The warm wind blew the bead curtain against the table, and then all of a sudden this conversation gets really serious, right? At this point, right, and up until this point, they're just having a conversation that normal couples have. After this point, it gets really serious, and they start having a very serious conversation that couples generally tend to have. And what I want you to think about within this conversation is, what's the deeper concern? It's going to be about an abortion, but both of them are going to come to this conversation with different fears. I want you to see whether you can get what she's afraid of and then what he's afraid of, right? Because it's kind of interesting how realistic Hemingway depicts this conversation, that it feels as though anyone could be having this. Maybe not necessarily about the specific topic, but the fears and the anxieties that get misdirected, we certainly tend to have within relationships. All right, so let's take a look at how he does that. He says, it's really an awfully simple operation, Jig, the man said. It's not really an operation at all, right? So the 1927's audience would take a look at that, right? An operation that's not really an operation by 2 people that are gallivanting around Europe, drinking a lot. They would immediately know an operation that's not an operation, it's an abortion. Hemingway couldn't have written the word abortion because it would have been censored. So instead of that, he kind of writes around the surface, or under the surface of that, which is true to his style anyway, so it actually fits in very well. So he encourages her, the man encourages her to get the operation, and then look what happens after this. The girl looked at the ground the table legs rested on, right? So whenever someone doesn't say something in a Hemingway story, they're actually saying a lot, right? They're suggesting something deeper under the surface. When you go home and your mother asks you, isn't it about time you get a job? Or isn't it about time you get married, right? Where do your eyes go, right? Your eyes go to the ground. You're looking away. What are you trying to do? You're trying to emotionally escape. And so Hemingway doesn't say the girl's trying to emotionally escape. He just says the girl looked at the ground the table legs rested on, which suggests she's trying to get away, right? So picking up on that, this is where the beauty of the interpretation comes in, right? The beauty of masterpieces is it allows us to make these connections, and it allows us to kind of say, oh, I get what Hemingway's doing there, right? And then he keeps encouraging her. I know you wouldn't mind it, Jig. And that's just kind of a nickname, a loving nickname that he calls her, right? It's not really anything. They just let the air in. And that's the second indication that this is an abortion. You let the air into the placenta and the fetus dies. Again, the girl did not say anything. So she's not agreeing with him, but she's also not disagreeing with him, and we can kind of interpret that differently, right? What would that mean that she's not disagreeing with him? And what does it mean that she's, not necessarily agreeing with him? There can be a lot of interpretation for that, right? And he says, I'll go with you and stay with you all the time. They just let the air in, and then it's all perfectly natural. And then her concern, right? What's her fear, right? Then what would we do afterward? We'll be fine afterward, just like we were before. What makes you think so? That's the only thing that bothers us. That's the only thing that's made us unhappy, right? So thinking about this tension within their relationship, what's going on beneath the surface, right? The girl looked at the bead curtain, put her hand out and took hold of the two of the string of beads. So again, she's still kind of trying to fidget and kind of get away from this conversation because she feels uncomfortable. And you think then we'll be all right and be happy, right? So what's her real fear? I know we will. You don't have to be afraid. I've known lots of people that have done it, right? So he's interpreting her fear as a physical fear for the procedure. But there's more to it than that, right? So Hemingway, and I think as the reader we're picking up on, there's more to it. He's missing kind of the actual deeper fear. And that's generally what happens within a relationship. One person says something, another person interprets it differently, and we have this kind of miscommunication. And then she says, after he says, I know lots of people have done it, so have I. And afterward they were all so happy, right? And then he says, well, the man said, if you don't want to do it, you don't have to. I've known a lot. I wouldn't have you do it if you didn't want to. But I know it's perfectly simple. And you really want to? I think it's the best thing to do. But I don't want to do it if you don't really want to, right? So again, what is she afraid of if she goes through with this abortion? And what is she afraid of if she doesn't, right? What's her real fear? And if I do it, you'll be happy and things will be like they were and you'll love me. I love you now. You know I love you. I know, but if I do it, then it will be nice again. If I say things like white elephants, and you'll like it. I'll love it. I love it now, but I just can't think about it. You know how I get when I worry. If I do it, you won't ever worry, right? So again, what's her fear? What's her concern? I won't worry about that because it's perfectly simple. And again, what's he mean by simple, right? What's his kind of deeper meaning to that? And what might be some misunderstandings about her, where she's coming from? Then I'll do it because I don't care about me. What do you mean? I don't care about me. Well, I care about you. Oh, yes, but I don't care about me. And I'll do it and then everything will be fine. I don't want you to do it if you feel that way, right? So again, that idea of fine can have that deeper 7/8 part of that interpretation, where it could be fine, like she's really going to be okay with it, or it could be fine, like whenever my wife says fine, it's not really fine. Someone's in trouble, and so it could be that as well, right? So he kind of backs off as he starts to hear, kind of as she's pushing subtly back, and as we get to this point in the story, I want you to think about who has power in the relationship, right? Does he have power, being the older person, being the person that's ordering the drinks, being the person that's able to speak the language, or is she the one that has the power within this relationship? And then how do we see that? And again, you can make an argument either way, and some people that frustrates because they only want it to be one way, they only see in black and white, but the real beauty of it is you can see it both ways, right? And we can lean towards one way or we can lean towards another way, and it just depends on how we're interpreting it, what we're choosing to emphasize. And then here's where we see an epiphany, right? In the literary world, we call this an epiphany, or a change in character, a sudden moment of insight that leads to a person's change in character. The girl stood up and walked to the end of the station. Across on the other side were fields of grain and trees along the banks of the Ebro River. Far away beyond the river were mountains, and this is the image that you see below, right? The shadow of a cloud moved across the field of grain, and she saw the river through the trees. And so this is the other part of that image that I showed you about. Like halfway through the story, she gets up and she sees this. And as she takes a look at this, again, either consciously or unconsciously, she's thinking about the baby, right? She's thinking about fertility. And then I want you to think about how she changes when she comes back. And we could have all this, she said, and we could have everything, and every day we make it more impossible, right? So this idea of childlike imaginations, we could have everything. She's like, no, actually, it's much more complicated than that. He says, what did you say? I said we could have everything. We can have everything, right? So again, the tables turn. Who has childlike imaginations now, right? As children that think one day they're going to be president of the whole world or whatever, that they could have everything, right? It's when you become an adult that you realize that you have to make some compromises and sacrifices, and things become much more complex. So she starts to see that complexity, and he thinks that it's still simple. So we see kind of a different dynamic starting to shift here. He says we can have everything. She says, no, we can't. We can have the whole world. No, we can't. We can go everywhere. So again, his concern is here, if we get rid of the baby, we could have everything that we've ever wanted. We can go everywhere. We can have liberty. We could have freedom. We can have everything we've ever wanted. And she's saying, no, it's not that simple, right? She says, no, we can't. It isn't ours anymore, right? So again, we have to think of what that ours means. That ours is a little bit ambiguous. Thinking about ours as the two of them, it's not the two of them anymore. There's more in this scenario now with the baby for us to consider. And he says, it's ours. She says, no, it isn't. And once they take it away, you'll never get it back. And again, that the pronoun here is ambiguous. Is the it referring to the baby? Is it referring to her innocence? Is it referring to part of their relationship, right? It's a little bit ambiguous, and it leaves room for interpretation. But they haven't taken it away. We'll wait and see, she says. And so she has great new insights and new kind of knowledge and information that she's coming with. He says, come on back in this shade. You mustn't feel that way. I don't feel any way, the girl said. I just know things. I don't want you to do anything that you don't want to do, and I want you to think about whether that's true or not. He is encouraging her to do it. He is pushing her to do it. So do you think he's trying to manipulate her to do it? Or do you think he's trying to encourage her because of some other fear? Does he, that he has? Is she manipulative, right? Kind of how's this dynamic working? And it's beautiful. Even though it's a very weighty topic that they're talking about, it's a very common, everyday kind of discussion that people in relationships generally tend to have as they kind of try to get their way, or as they have their concerns, they have their anxieties, but they don't necessarily address them specifically. They go around it in a kind of roundabout sort of way, partly because they don't necessarily want to address it, but partly because they might not know what these unconscious desires and fears are. She says, I realize, the girl said, can't we maybe stop talking? And this is what she's really wanted all along. When she's looking at the ground the table legs rested on, she just doesn't want to talk about it, right? So to her, the conversation is over. And again, what does that mean, right? Has she made up her mind? And if she has, which way is she going? They sat down at the table, and the girl looked across at the hills on the dry side of the valley, and the man looked at her and at the table. So again, she's looking at that barren side. Thinking, right? And Hemingway doesn't ever tell us that. He just leaves us up to us to make that connection. And now he's looking at her, and now he's looking away. But then he encourages her again. You've got to realize, he said, that I don't want you to do it if you don't want to. I'm perfectly willing to go through with it if it means anything to you. Again, is that the baby? Is that the pregnancy? Is it a relationship? I don't know what, is it marriage? What's the it here? And it's a little bit ambiguous, which is great, right? Some people are frustrated with it, but I think that's great. Doesn't it mean anything to you? We could get along. Of course it does. And here's, I think, where we get some deeper insight into what he is afraid of, his unconscious fear. Of course it does. But I don't want anybody but you. I don't want anyone else. And I know it's perfectly simple. What's he afraid of, right? Generally what happens, and Hemingway's capturing this beautifully here, what men tend to be afraid of when women have a baby is that they've gone from maybe in the top 5 of a woman's priorities to falling out of the top 100, right? So he's worried about that dynamic change, right? He's worried about how that's going to change the relationship and where he is. And so his unconscious fear that we see. She says, yes, it's perfectly simple, right? And again, that idea of what the simplicity is kind of interesting, because he's suggesting that the simplicity is within the procedure itself. A lot of people have done it. It's actually a simple procedure. They go into the doctor's office. It's over within a couple of minutes. But she's suggesting that the simplicity is not what he suggests it is, right? The simple operation is not what she's concerned with. The complexity comes afterwards in dealing with this, right? And the complexity also is not just the procedure, but is also if she does go through with the pregnancy, that does add some complexity to the relationship because he doesn't want the baby, right? So no matter what she does, it's going to be a complex thing, right? He says, it's all right for you to say that, but I do know it. Would you do something for me now? I'd do anything for you. Would you please, 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 please stop talking? Right, so again, now she tells him to really be quiet because this is what she truly wants. So then he kind of is reeling with this new information and trying to think and process through it. The girl smiled brightly at the woman. So the woman comes in now with the drinks. And this is the first time we see her smile. And so again, what does that mean? Has she made up her mind? And if so, what does that mean? To thank her. He says, I'd better take the bags over to the other side of the station. the man said, and she smiled at him. Again, it seems like they've come to some type of consensus or some type of understanding. Maybe there's going to be a couple more discussions about this, but it seems like at this point, at least in the relationship, she seems pretty content. She's smiling at him. And again, we have to think about what that means, that he's taking his bags over to the other side of the station. Think about where they were at the beginning and where they're headed now. He picked up the 2 heavy bags and carried them around the station to the other track. So are they changing directions, or are they going in the direction that they were going before? He looked up the tracks but could not see the train. Coming back, he walked through the bar room where people waiting for the train were drinking. He drank an anise at the bar and looked at the people. They were all waiting reasonably for the train. They went out through the bead curtain. She was sitting at the table and smiled at him. Again, there's this connection. There was a disagreement, but they're coming back together in harmony. He asked, "Do you feel better?" Again, what's that mean? Is it, do you feel better? Was she feeling kind of sick before? Or does that mean that, do you feel better that we've taken the bags to the other side of the station, or we're going a different direction, right? So there's some ambiguity there. She says, again, "I feel fine," which again, what's that mean? There's nothing wrong with me. I feel fine. And so as we think about your papers, right, I want you to think about what, focusing on maybe the setting as we see here. What's the setting mean? How does it bear into the interpretation of the story? As we think about the character development, perhaps of Jig, has she changed within the story? Has the American changed within the story? As we think about the argument, right? I don't want you to do plot summary. Just tell me what happened within the story. I want you to tell me why what happened is important. Did she have the abortion? Did she not? How do we know? What textual elements can you point to support your argument? And that's really what an academic argument is all about.